from useful to beautiful, aesthetic paralysis in the naturalized rural landscape. In addition to problems of environmental degradation and social conflict and inequality, new exurban residents face the dismay of finding that their escape from the modern urban landscape does not necessarily provide the nature they had imagined, as well as disillusionment and not knowing what to do or how to engage with their new rural setting. Most exurban residents who talked with me praised the natural qualities of the landscape to which they had moved in contrast to the urban or suburban landscape they had moved from. This was particularly true in the New England and Ontario cases. In Ontario, all but one family had moved to the exurbs from the city of Toronto. However, many expressed a certain disappointment with their experience there. Some were distressed with the changes in the landscape, evidence that many other people had chosen to move there too. Others experienced a version of the disillusionment described by Spektorsky, having hoped for the idyll of the ideal life closer to nature, and in many cases, having allowed their expectation to lead into the realm of fantasy. They were dismayed that knowledge of what to do with the landscape did not come along with their properties. Several expressed frustration at the difficulty of making their dreams real. They have found that escape to the sojourn of nature is not enough. Meaningful experience entails not only being in the right place, but doing something there. The solace of a rural way of life and a connection to nature seem particularly important to residents for whom the ideas rural and nature remain abstract and elusive. When talking about their expectations of exurban life, these residents often sound perplexed and somewhat bitter at the difference between their expectations and experiences of life in the country. Residents like these aspire to the rural-esque exurban life because they have inscribed in it and its natural settings many things they idealize but don't know how to achieve. Likewise, they want to do something amidst the aesthetic of the productive landscape, but don't know what. For many of these residents, the processes of the rural landscape are as opaque as their unconscious preference for idealized and aestheticized versions of rural land uses. Implicitly, they prefer dilapidated barns to smelly active ones, and conservation areas to working forests. But the accumulation of conserved land in Exurbia does not necessarily live up to the widely supported justifications for conserving land. When I visit hobby farms and exurban forests, I am always looking for evidence that access to so much green space might be helping people there to learn to live more sustainably, or to understand more about the conditions they might be able to create that would better align their goals of habitation with the functions of the ecosystems they and everyone else depend on from the green space. In short, I am looking for evidence that exurban conservation does something other than accumulate landscape around those who can afford it. However, what I tend to see is that over-romanticization of trees alienates people from straightforward acknowledgement of existing interactions they do have with trees and with the rest of the environment in which they participate. When agency in the environment is effaced and capacity to experience and understand everyday environments is undermined, it becomes more difficult to engage successfully with environmental aspirations, goals, and public planning processes. Barriers arise between present and past environmental experiences that could help people learn about inhabitation, and between the present and possible alternative futures to which exurban aspirations could be directed. Living with the pastoral, death in the very midst of delight. A dramatic shift in the perception of human agency vis-a-vis trees occurred around the end of the 19th century, around the same time that current North American settlement forms were coalescing into their present forms. Analyzing changes in the image of the land during the rise of metropolitan Ontario, historian Allan describes the process of forest clearing and settlement as vanquishing, quote, the sense that the land was covered by a terrifying and impenetrable overgrowth, end quote, and replacing this overwhelming image of the forest with the notion of a, quote, subdued and pleasant collection of quite manageable trees, end quote. Although the common response to the bush at this point had been to see it as much more terrifying than sublime, Smith highlights the shift in the 1880s from a forbidding toward a more aesthetic forest, with what he calls the frontiersman's ultimate question, quote, in this brave new world, where the odor of the woods is a tonic, and the air brings healing and balm, how can death exist? End quote. What had been impenetrable and forbidding forest was becoming an appealing forest of recreation and transient wonder. In a contemporary effort to convince the American and Canadian publics that forests were not all about pragmatism, Gifford Pinchot, a major champion of thoughtful conservation of forests, invoked this imaginative shift that came with the diminishing of the forest primeval. In his effort to promote the management agency that would become the U.S. National Forest Service, Pinchot asked the public to overcome both resourcist and overawed visions of the forest, and to consider cultural and palpable relationship with the forest instead. Quote, "The forest is as beautiful as it is useful. The old fairy tales which spoke of it as a terrible place are wrong. No one can really know the forest without feeling the gentle influence of one of the kindliest and strongest parts of nature. From every point of view, it is one of the most helpful friends of man." End quote. This idea of a gentle influence and kindly friendliness clearly resonates with the large numbers of people who have decided to take up residence in the forest. Current understandings of the forest have swung around to confirm Pinchot's assertion the forest is as beautiful as it is useful. But what has happened to the understanding of a forest as helpful, or as useful as it is beautiful? As Nick Luca asserts in Chapter 6 of this book, at least part of the gap between the forest of everyday experience and that of aspiration has been produced through the construction of landscapes of leisure, and through the separation of working life from residential life, and especially through temporary sojourns in the recreational forest. If, as Luca suggests, the exurban landscape aspires to the extremely pleasant, if not temporally durable, cottage life, if everyday life aspires to an Arcadian ideal, how can exurbanites also, concurrently, reflexively inhabit a life world produced out of the very materials to which they turn to try to buffer themselves from the impacts of urban modernity? Interpretation of Nicolas Poussin's Shepherds in Arcadia, a classic 17th century painting in the pastoral tradition, points to the relation that bridges the working world of production and the fantasy relied upon in the exurban landscape. In the painting, shepherds consider a tombstone in an Edenic landscape, bearing the inscription, Et in Arcadia ego, I too am in Arcadia. Art historians such as Erwin Panofsky and Giovanni Pietro Bellori have argued over who speaks the words inscribed on its central tombstone. The shepherds might be celebrating their heavenly abode, but it's more likely death, reminding them of its omnipresence. The historians agree that the shepherds are absorbed in the contemplation of mortality, and, as Panofsky points out, that this is a shift not unlike that to follow, from useful to beautiful, in the popular imagination of forests. Quote, "Poussin no longer shows a dramatic encounter with death." End quote. Describing the painting as Poussin's critique that the pastoral ideal is illusory, Bellori interprets the painting in a way that for me evokes forest succession ecology, as a reminder that, quote, "the grave is to be found even in Arcady, and that death occurs in the very midst of delight." End quote. As exurbanites and exurban land managers attempt to come to terms with the turn toward conservation and the rapprochement of urban and rural land uses and land use values, including the valuation of forests as both beautiful and useful, these moments of change in the terms of the imagination of death and nature may provide insights into how to reincorporate the useful into aesthetics of the everyday landscape. This concluding section explores what transformation of exurban landscape ideals might be possible if changeable everyday environment were better understood through acknowledgement of the way exurbia functions as a modern pastoral. If trees die, what happens to idealized landscapes? At the Cedar Grove Farm this weekend, I found a Back to the Land classic on constructing residence using recycled building materials, old tires, and earth. The book explained how the motivation for this brand of ecologically sound building rests on an emulation of trees. Disparaging the unsustainable lifestyles of earthlings, Earthship Volume 1 introduces its ideology of habitation with a parable from the point of view of aliens who visit Earth and describe the living habits of trees, animals, and humans. with nothing good to say about the humans, concentrating mainly on their tendency to soil their own nests. The aliens sing rapt praises to trees, who not only stay rooted to their home places, but also appear to embody the balanced system dynamics seen as desirable from a mid-1970s environmental crisis perspective. Despite their obvious differences from humans, trees, for these authors, as for so many of the aspiring exurban residents whose stories I have heard, symbolize and perhaps even model an ideal way of life. This idealization of trees is a problem in the changing and often perplexing modern urban landscape. In the face of change or the unknown, our impulse, as Tom Looker elaborates in Chapter 9, is too often to clamp down on complexity and ambiguity and to force resolution. In attempts to reconcile nature's promise with the shortcomings of everyday environments, openness to contradiction and complexity assists our ability to resist idealizing nature as pure and humanless. This openness also assists in avoiding the pitfalls of vilifying ourselves and our neighbors, as the Earthship authors do, in such a way that we see efforts to more reflexively and equitably inhabit our environments as always inadequate and hence not worth prioritizing. Some goals for a nice place to live may be more or less summed up by the billboard promise of a magnificent landscape for living. However, if the more interesting and inspiring goals of habitation are represented as unachievable, a natural landscape without us in it, it is not surprising if people respond to the daunting task of understanding the human place in the environment by wanting to escape to nature. Demystifying the way that nature is made into a fetish may open more space for people to work toward their goals through the complexity and ambiguity that are inherent in socio-environmental relations. Perhaps if there were more opportunity within both everyday and official environmental planning for critical dialogue around how to make the benefits of natural landscapes more equitably accessible, the search for a modern pastoral would not so often lead to deferment and self-deceptive accumulation of green space, but could include a kind of critical fetishism, in which the goals associated with nature became objects of analysis themselves, used to help keep open questions about whose nature against the pastoral tendency toward closure. In addition, this engagement with everyday goals associated with nature and with trees might help people transcend the alienation and disempowerment that exaggerated awe has encouraged. The moral ambiguity of the exurbs hinges on this awe and disempowerment, which helps keep people firmly out of nature and preserves an ideology of nature as worthy of aesthetic worship by the elect few, but not of everyday interaction. Wanting to inhabit nature, but thinking of humans outside it, we become blind to our own agency in the creation of the landscapes we experience. We forget that it is people, as much as nature, who have written the story there. We've made this landscape we call natural. If we pretend that what we find in the exurban forest is an entirely natural environment, we deny to ourselves that the exurban landscape embodies our contingent history and the goals and desires we embed there. Reading residential landscapes provides opportunities for us to read back to ourselves the aspirations we have written into our home environments, but it can also intensify the desire to cover up with greenery problems such as poverty and pollution. The landscape of Exurbia does tell us about the social and environmental problems people are trying to hide there, or hide from. Understanding the motivations for retreating to nature, or for trying to make landscapes more natural, can help clarify what is disturbing about the unnatural parts of modern society, and can help sort out why nature seems like a good answer to problems that seem too complex to face. Exurban demands on nature demonstrate the intensity of wishes to evade responsibility, and instead to turn toward the beneficent nature our culture has constructed to escape the risk and failure we face, especially when it comes to questions of environmental management. When the desire for a comfortable home environment becomes contingent on the provenance of symbolic trees in the home grove, people become more inclined to view forests as an eternal paradise. This image of perfection obscures the changing, messy forests on which we actually depend, where, as surprising as we might find it, the trees lose limbs and die, both on their own and through human activity. The Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources film on the forestry industry quoted above presents the prospect of everyday life without the death of trees and a humorous series of scenes in which the main character imagines the forestry-dependent props of everyday life disappearing out from under him, one by one, his newspaper, rocking chair, and house. Recognizing the aesthetic attachment to a fundamentally static nature and the widespread unwillingness to accept the mortality of trees, the U.S. National Park Service staff have pinned a paper sign onto a tree that has recently fallen near the visitor entrance to the Muir Woods, explaining that death happens naturally in a forest. In this token space of wilderness, an explanation of succession can be read as a monument to the persistence in the public of the ideal of trees' immortality, but also as a step in our public culture toward coming to terms with their mortality. This idea of succession may be a palatable way to open up the dialogue around death and nature in a culture so afraid of its own concern for the environment and afraid of where interest in wilderness and ecology might lead, if not to pleasant escape. The pleasant escape of Exurbia, as complicated as it is, presents a more straightforward set of responsibilities than poverty and social justice, industrial contamination and exploitation, the prospect of catastrophic climate change, and the complex mesh of cultural and social relations upon which our modern society is based. As Andrew Blum and Tom Looker have argued in previous chapters, however, interest in leading a natural life is heavily tempered by significant investment in leading modern lives. Exurbia, premised as it is on Blum's air world of telecommunications, travel, and global economics, is a modern pastoral, and its version of the good life has as much to do with data lines and consumption as it does with natural or sylvan ideals. More rigorous engagement with the related ecological processes and material throughput of residential environments may encourage at least some people toward reflexive inhabitation in those environments, to forge a meaningful connection to the forests in which trees grow and die, and to negotiate productive processes and social relations with which we are better able to ethically reconcile ourselves. This engagement needs to be critical, at home in the uncertainty of modernity, able to inhabit ambiguity and to acknowledge and work through the pastoral impulse, an engagement that does not need to turn to a sentimentally pastoral vision for comfort and closure. In the face of what art historian Lucy Lepard calls the lure of the local, the desire to retreat to the enclosure of the aesthetic locality or to nature's solace, we must consider our local landscapes in the context of the complex global and regional processes of which they are a part. But I have come to the end of this chapter feeling sterner about the emotions people have for trees than I mean to. Noticing a branch broken off a white pine from last night's storm on my way home today, I felt a pang. Had I spent enough time looking at that tree? Was it old? Was it going to die? Acknowledging my pang of affection for this tree and for trees in general, I sympathize with a sense of generative connection with the natural environment, with the sojourn and stimulation provided by the patterns and motion of trees in the wind and weather, with a likely to be irrational attachment to what they symbolize. Considering my attachment and affection, I also recognize that what bothers me about the way we tend to relate to trees is the discrepancy I've been describing between this pleasantly thought-of relationship with the environment and the much less inspiring and conflicted way we actually behave. While preservation rhetoric has made it acceptable to consume far-off forests, air pollution has traced a widening swath into places where trees like sugar maples will no longer reproduce, an identity disaster for Toronto, and climate change threatens to rearrange the placement of our ecosystems faster than our arboreal neighbors can adapt, at the same time that we have decided to value them so highly, to seek residence amidst the landscape they dominate. Negotiating pastoral landscapes, making Exurbia inhabitable. Acknowledging both modernity and mortality may be an important first step in becoming comfortable in dynamic environments, and in realizing that all environments are dynamic. If we are reluctant to embrace change and death and images of the ideal life, we can take comfort in succession, that phenomenon of forest change of which naturalist Henry Thoreau remains an eloquent champion, in which death and change are integral parts of renewal and adaptation. If, as Thoreau observed, trees reproduce, grow, and die, our relationship with forests changes from the simple question of to protect or to cut and becomes much more nuanced. Whose forests are these? If they are public, as many forests that attract adjacent exurbanization are, what could we do with them? How can these goals, of which there will be many, be reconciled with each other? In telling about his own quest to find and answer these questions in the polluted, sprawling landscape of exurban Massachusetts, Frank Golke captures the essence of the way in which Thoreau's careful observation of succession disrupts the apathy and helplessness of the vision of trees as immortal, and pushes back against a pastoral understanding of Thoreau as a patron saint of exurban escape. Describing the way in which learning to be at home in an alien place invites us into an understanding of the environments we inhabit, Golke describes how, quote, in Thoreau's manner of living and in the writing that flowed from it, he provided our first paradigm for loving, through its details, a fallen world, end quote. Exploring the detritus of a complex and changing environment may help us to acknowledge the imperfection of the natural environment and to negotiate our place in it without deferring our agency to some ideal of a modern pastoral. Quote, because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees. End quote. Adrian Rich, What Kind of Times Are These?